Hello, 22 Tony here, with another discussion on collecting vintage and antique ammo. Today I'd like to talk about Federal. Now most of you are probably familiar with Federal. They're one of the largest manufacturers of ammo today, but you may not be familiar with their rocky start. The Federal Cartridge and Machine Company was actually incorporated in 1916. They produced their first shotgun shells on January 5th, 1917. Now obviously these aren't original 1917 Federal shotgun shells, but they're the only Federal shells I had, so just for display I put out what I had here. Now Federal in the early days was hoping to get some government contracts. If you're familiar with history, in 1916, 1917, Europe was at war. The Americans weren't involved yet, but I think pretty much the general public was expecting it to happen, and so were the owners and managers of Federal, and they were hoping to get some government contracts. Well, it didn't turn out that that worked out for them. They did get some international government contracts, but no U.S. government contracts, and they did have a rocky start, to say the least. The company was renamed in 1918 Federal Cartridge Company, but again, with a rocky start and financial troubles, they ended up filing for bankruptcy in 1920. Well, in 1922, the company was acquired and renamed Federal Cartridge Corporation. Now, the Federal website, if you go to the Federal website and look it up, they don't even mention the early years. They just say that they went into business in 1922. So I don't know if they're not proud of the early years or if they just didn't feel it was important, but they don't even mention it. But in 1922, they did go back into business producing shotgun shells, and apparently did fairly well. They, in 1924, purchased the American Cartridge Company, and at that point started producing 22. So of course, I'm 22 Tony. We want to talk about 22. Well, the original Federal packaging was a one-piece package. By 1924, pretty much everybody had moved over to the one-piece package instead of the two-piece. So as far as I know, Federal never produced a two-piece package. But in 1932, they did produce their first high velocity. And then in 1937, they came up with something that was somewhat unique. They called it the airline cartridge or shell. The bullet itself was without grooves. It was a smooth bullet, and it was dry coated. Now I don't have one of those early airline boxes here today, but it was very similar to this Monarch box. The only difference is instead of Monarch, it said airline, but it was a similar design with the bullseye design. Now the airline ran from 1937 to 1942, and it was replaced with the Monarch and the High Power. Now, Monarch and High Power were around for many years. This particular Monarch box, this is a 1941 introduced box. And the same basic design ran till 1962. Now, there were some changes along the line. The print on the back did change a few times. The child warnings were added in 1962. But this particular package basically ran for most of that period of time. Now the High Power, I don't have one of the early High Powers here today. I've got a 1962 High Power, and this one you can see with the child warning printed on the front. So this is, I know this is a 1962 issue. So these actually ran, the Monarch and the High Power actually ran into the late 60s. In 1967, Federal switched over to a different packaging for the High Power. So this is a 1967 type package. Well, they did change a few things over the next few years. They introduced the Federal Power Flight. Those were introduced in 1970. They were around for a few years, but by 1970, Power Flight was replaced with Federal Lightning. And those of you who have seen my other videos know that Federal Lightning is what got me started in this collecting business. So the Federal Lightning ran for a few years. I also have this is a particularly interesting box here. This is a Federal Champion box. Now this box is kind of unique that it was a special introduction in 1982. It was kind of a reprint of an earlier box, but it was a promotional box that was introduced in 1982 and ran for a few years. What's unique about this one is in 1982 the whole world was adding barcodes. This one does not have one. So this was a very short period of time. This particular box was produced without a barcode, and immediately the barcodes were added. So it's kind of unique in that this is only a very short period of time that this was produced. And after the barcodes were introduced, those of you that know me know that I'm not real interested in collecting anything after the barcodes were introduced. But for those of you that are, again, Federal is still producing heavily today. And they are one of the leading manufacturers of ammunition in the United States. In addition to .22 and shotgun, they do produce handgun ammunition, rifle ammunition. So they are a big manufacturer. Now there's one thing though about Federal that you may not be aware of. Federal, from their early days, as I mentioned, they had a rough go of it, and they had to do whatever they could in order to sell their ammunition. And one of the ways they sold their ammunition was through retailers. Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward's, Gamble's, and others. So those of you that are familiar with the retail packaging, here's a Hawthorne. This particular box was a Montgomery Ward's box, and sold for 99 cents. I'm not sure the exact date on this one. I didn't look it up. I believe this was mid-60s. It does have the child warning on the front. So it's sometime after 1962, but as you open it up and look, you can see that it does have the familiar Federal head stamp. So Federal did what they had to do, and they started at very shaky beginnings at best, and worked their way through it and came up with unique advertising and unique distribution routes, and built themselves into, again, one of the leading manufacturers of ammunition in the world today. Now, as usual with my my videos, this is not designed to tell you everything there is to know about Federal. In fact, I encourage you to read up, particularly on the early years of Federal. It was very interesting what you might find out. I hope this is something that interests you. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope you'll watch my other ones. Please feel free to subscribe and definitely share. Thanks for watching. Bye.